Hello, my name is Camille Parmesan. I'm a professor at Plymouth University in England and at the University of Texas in Austin. I'm going to be talking to you today about my research on wild species and how they're responding to recent climate change. In other words, how they're living in a warmer world. So to understand where we're going in a time of rapid climate change, it helps to understand that we're already seeing large impacts from relatively small levels of warming. My own research is on how human-caused climate change has affected wildlife. The changes we're observing in wild species are a clear and simple indicator that the climate has indeed been altered. And they also give us a sense of what's in store in coming decades. It's no surprise to biologists that our most cold-adapted species, such as those in polar climates, are showing declines in range contractions, and this is happening in both the Arctic and in the Antarctic as their climate spaces, in other words sea ice, disappears. We're also seeing large range contractions of cold-adapted mountaintop species as lower elevation populations go extinct and their ranges become more and more restricted to the highest peaks. Like polar species, mountaintop species often have nowhere to go, and two such species are now extinct. Fortunately, as we go towards the equator, species do have room to move, and we're seeing species ranges shifting northward from Europe into Scandinavia and from the USA into Canada. And as we go further towards the equator, species are shifting from Africa into Europe and from Mexico into the USA. Movements in the ocean are even larger because although the oceans are warming less than land in an absolute sense, the temperature of the ocean changes less with each degree of latitude than on land. So a marine species has to shift further than a terrestrial species to maintain a constant environment as temperatures warm. And the average movements hide the fact that some species ranges are moving very fast over very short time frames, 200 to 400 kilometers poleward per decade. And migrants are becoming residents in places that they have never overwintered before. The other major type of change we're seeing is earlier timing of spring events. And again, we're seeing differences across groups in their magnitude of response. Amphibians are showing the largest shifts in breeding. Birds and butterflies are shifting their emergence and breeding more than our plants. And in the oceans, predators are shifting more than their prey. This suggests that interactions among species are changing in their level of synchrony. When you put all this together, we're seeing about half of species changing where they live, some 2/3 of species changing when they lived, shifting towards earlier timing in spring, and this is happening across all groups, on every continent, and in every ocean. As climate change drives species into new areas, some have become invasive, like this urchin, whose range shifted poleward into Tasmanian waters as temperatures there rose above the 12 degrees centigrade threshold for urchin breeding. The urchins quickly degraded the habitat by eating up all the kelp, and diverse kelp forest became urchin barrens. But in marine protected areas, huge native spiny lobsters thrive because they're protected from fishing. Spiny lobsters are the only predator of these urchins left, and they've prevented the urchin from becoming invasive within the protected areas. We have a similar message from coral reefs. High ocean temperatures have caused large-scale bleaching around the world, but in reefs that have a healthy abundance of native fish, corals recover after bleaching events. In unhealthy reefs, recovery is slow or not at all, as the kelp and algae takes over. The moral from these studies is that a healthy ecosystem is both more resistant and more resilient to harmful impacts of climate change. Just as with the human body, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Improving the basic health of ecosystems will help fight off the worst effects of climate change. The Kino checker spot butterfly typifies a conservation dilemma caused by climate change. Kino is being squeezed between the growth of Los Angeles and San Diego, which has destroyed nearly all its northern range, and climate change, which threatens its southern range. I've been advising conservation practitioners to consider assisted colonization, helping species colonize new areas outside their historic range by physically moving them. A relatively simple solution that we can help many species. While this action was being debated for Kino, this amazing butterfly found its own solution. It shifted east, up the mountains, by switching to a novel host plant for laying its eggs, thus allowing it to move into an undeveloped area and protecting it from climate change. The moral from the Kino butterfly is that species can adapt to small levels of climate change in surprising ways if we give them options, if they have somewhere to go to. But many endangered species are surrounded by inhospitable lands, cities, and agricultural fields, and they cannot make such a move on their own. Wild species need our help to restore habitats through which they can move and to create new areas outside their historic ranges into which they can colonize as their climate spaces shift across the lands and across the oceans. Restoring native habitats is not only good for conservation, but because native landscapes typically store more carbon than human-dominated landscapes, restoration is also a mitigation action. In other words, restoring native habitats, native prairies, native seagrass will help suck up carbon out of the atmosphere and reduce the amount of climate change that we'll have. In the face of rapid climate change, conservation biologists are forced to rethink what it means to preserve biodiversity. We have to move away from the notion of protecting against change, trying to make things stay as they always have, because things are changing. We need to move towards a broader view of protecting the functioning of biodiversity in a general sense and at a global scale rather than a local scale. And we want to preserve the experience of diverse nature for future generations to enjoy as we have.